Welcome back to another web development tutorial. In this project I'm going to show you how to build this currency converter app, and if you've ever struggled to understand how the async and await keywords work, then keep watching as I guarantee this video will clear things up for you. So by the end of this tutorial you'll have a good understanding of how to get data from an API using the await keyword, populate select elements in a form with the response from the API, and catch any errors in the async code and display them to the user. So let's get started coding our currency converter app. So before we get stuck into the meaty part of creating the JavaScript which will do our currency conversion, let's first of all get set up with some markup on the page and then style it so it looks like a kind of currency converter app that someone would want to use. So we'll start off over here in our HTML and we're just going to add in some markup. So let's create a overall container for our actual currency converter, and I'm just going to give this an ID of currency converter. Mainly so we can target it in our CSS. You could use a class if you like. And then we're going to add a div in here with a class of title. So we want to add some styles to the title. And then I'm just going to use a heading level 1 tag and then just put in the text of convert. And then also just for a little bit of interest as well, I'm just going to add in a little icon just before the convert text. So for that I'm going to use hero icons, which is kind of like the icon framework that goes along with the Tailwind CSS framework. So I'm just going to type in here money, for example, and you can see we've got a few different currency types of icons. So I'm just going to copy the currency dollar icon here as an SVG, and then all we need to do in our markup here is come over and I'm just going to put that before the actual text of the heading level 1 tag inside of this title class. And it does apply a few classes for us, but I'm just going to remove these as Tailwind specific classes, which we're not using for this tutorial. So I'm just going to get rid of those. But what you'll find is that this is a massive icon that we've got on our page at the moment. So we're going to sort that out with our CSS shortly. But let's carry on and create the rest of the markup for our currency converter, which is basically going to be a form which will allow users to enter the amount and then select the different types of currency that they want to convert between. So that is the title done. Let's just close that up there. So what's the best way to create a form in HTML? Well, the best way is to use the form tag, of course. And we're not going to be posting any data anywhere. We're going to be doing it all inside of the JavaScript app. So we'll get rid of the action. And then we'll say this form is called a convert form. And the ID is very important, as you'll see in just a short while, because we'll need to target that in our JavaScript to make sure that we catch the events of when that's submitted. And essentially what we're going to have inside this form is a load of different labels and inputs, and the select boxes we're going to actually populate with our JavaScript later on. So what we're going to have inside this form is an input for the amount value, and then 2 select boxes which selects the from and to currencies, and then a button just to submit the form as well. So I'm going to add 3 divs inside of here, and inside each div there'll be a label, and we're going to create first of all for the a label for the amount input, and we'll create an input here, and I'll actually set the type as number. There are a few good reasons why you shouldn't do this, but for our tutorial it'll just make things easier to ensure that the user can't type in any text into this HTML input box. So the ID for that is amount, and we'll just set an initial value of 0 just so it's filled in when the form loads. And then in this second div here, I'll go down here, again we'll have another label, and this one's going to be the from currency, so the base currency that we're transforming from, so we'll say from here. And then the input this time is actually just a select box, so we'll create an empty select here, and the ID for that will be the from currency, matching the label for property. And then same sort of thing down here in the final div, we'll have in there the to currency. So we'll just update those. So you can see now on our page we've got those inputs appearing, and you'll notice these select boxes are actually empty at the moment. So we're going to need to think of a way of actually populating those select boxes with all of the currencies that we want to convert from and to, and we'll see how to do that in our JavaScript when we get onto that section. But the last thing that we need inside of our form is just to create a button for the submit process. So let's create a button element here, and I'll just call it convert there, the text on there. And then one final thing that we need outside of the actual form is somewhere to actually display the result of the conversion. So as a placeholder outside of the form elements, we're going to create another div, one final div here, with an ID of convert result, and we'll use this in our JavaScript to actually insert some text, which will be the result of the conversion or any errors if they occur. So nothing too scary here. Hopefully you're familiar with all of this type of markup, but obviously it looks a bit rubbish in our preview here. So let's go into our CSS and add some styling. So the first thing I'm going to do is just set the font family for everything on the actual page, and we'll just go with sans serif, nice plain font there. And we'll also set the box sizing to be border box. Okay, and we're going to center everything in the page that we've got open. So let's target our HTML elements and just set the height to be 100%. And then similarly inside of our body, we'll set the height of that to be 100%. The display is going to be a flex container, and we'll set the flex direction to be a column. And then from there we can say align the items inside of the flex container to be in the center, and then justify the content to be centered as well. And you can see now that this is kind of centered in the page. And when we make that icon smaller, it should all line up nicely in the center of our preview that we've got open. So we created an element with an ID of currency converter, which was kind of like the container for our currency converter app. So from there, we're going to add some padding to this container, 10 pixels on top and bottom and 20 on left and right. We'll set a border radius of 10 pixels, and then we'll add some box shadow. So we'll say the box shadow will go 0 pixels for the x-axis, but we'll actually push it down on the y-axis by 4 pixels. A bit of blur and spread, and then we'll set the color to be a black color with an opacity of 0.2. And you can see we've got a nice card effect for our currency container now. So the other thing we need to look at is the title as well, and get rid of that huge icon that we've got at the moment. So we'll say currency converter, and we'll target the title class, the div with the title class inside of there, and then we'll say the display of that is flex, and we want to align the items to be centered. So this will just put everything on one line for us, so getting closer to a smaller icon. And then the other thing we'll do is we'll target the actual its SVG directly itself. So could give this a specific class, but there's only one SVG, and we're going to keep everything simple for this tutorial. So we'll set the width of the SVG to be 30 pixels and just put a margin right of 5 pixels. We'll actually set a text color on this to be a specific value. Let's go for a nice blue color here. So if we sort of kind of pale blue color, and that should update the icon, which it hasn't. So I've probably made a typo here somewhere. So we've got currency converter, misspelled converter there. So now you can see we've got this blue icon with the $sign and also our heading tag in there too. Probably just want to make that heading tag a little bit smaller. So again, from the currency main elements, we want to target the title, the heading level 1 tag, and we'll set the font size to be explicitly 18 pixels. And we'll also make sure it's got a bold or a black font weight as well. So that's a bit more in line with the text that we've already got on the page. So the next thing we're going to do is actually target the convert form. And if you remember, we've got all of those divs inside of there. So the convert form itself has got 3 divs in the button, and inside the divs is the labels and the inputs. So let's target the divs first of all. So in the convert form, when we encounter a div, what we want to do is set the display of that to be flex. The flex direction will be column, and also just a bit of margin on the top and bottom, so there's some space between each of them. So now we've got more of a vertical form as we had in the start when we demoed the app. So let's also target the labels as well, so that they've got, so we can adjust their font weight and so forth. So convert form, when we encounter a div, go into the label. So the font weight for that again will be black, the 900 value. Font size 12 pixels, and we'll also put a bit of margin on those as well, so they're kind of pushed away from the inputs and select boxes, just helping to space things out a little bit more. And it's always a nice thing to actually target the inputs and make a few slight changes just to make them look a bit nicer rather than the built-in browser defaults. So we're going to target the convert form when we encounter a div, the input, but we also want to do that for the select boxes as well. So as inputs and select, we're going to use these same rules. So we'll set a border to be 1 pixel solid, and then we'll use a grey colour, so something quite light, but not so light that you can't see it. So something along those lines. So yeah, it's just faded them into the background. So yeah, that's looking quite nice. And then we'll also add some box shadow to these. So 0 pixels on the X, 3 pixels pushed down on the Y, and then we'll just add some blur on that as well. And then we'll use RGBA and a black color again with an opacity of 0.1. We'll also add a border radius to this as well. So border radius of 6 pixels. And then we'll give that some padding as well to make them a little bit larger and easier to type in. There you go, you can see our inputs have been updated and they're looking a lot nicer. The other thing that we need to do is actually to target the button as well and then change the styling for that. So within our convert form, we've got the button. So we'll make it 100% width. We'll use the same background color as we had before. So we had this blue color down here. And we'll set the color to be white, take off the border, and then also we'll put some margin just on the top and bottom, and also some padding inside of the button as well. Probably because of the way we've set it up, put cursor pointer on there as well, so we get the hand icon when you actually hover over it. But that looks like a nice button that we want to click, and it goes well with the rest of the form. So the only other thing that we need to add styling to, which isn't important at the moment but will be later on, is the convert result. So remember, there's a div at the bottom of the form, or just outside the form, which is where we're going to be putting the result of the conversion. So we'll target that with our CSS as well, just so that there's some rules set up. So we'll say width is 100%, margin 20 pixels on the top, 0 on the left and right, and we'll also set the font weight to be 900. But also we might encounter some errors with our code or with our lookup for our exchange rate conversion. So let's add an additional class onto the convert result element, and we'll just here set the background color to be red and the text color to be white, and the padding to be 20 pixels. So we'll use the convert result element later on to actually display the result, and if there is an error we can add this class which will indicate that there is a problem with that conversion. There you go, we've got a nice looking form ready to fill out. Of course the select boxes aren't populated. If you click on them there's nothing in there and the convert button won't do anything. So that's where our JavaScript comes in. So we're going to head over there now and start coding up the actual functionality of our currency converter app. So throughout this JavaScript, we're going to be creating several functions, and we're going to join them all together to actually create a working form. But there are two kind of stages really. We need to set up the form in the sense of getting the actual currency options and populating those select boxes. And then we need to set up an event listener so that when the user clicks that convert button, it actually does the work of converting between the two currencies. And don't forget, the purpose of this tutorial really is to get you familiar with using async and await with promises. So hopefully by the time we've got through this JavaScript, you'll have a good understanding of how and when to use async and await. So the first function I'm going to create is something called getCurrencyOptions. So we'll say getCurrencyOptions is equal to an arrow function, and we're going to use an API to actually get the available different currency options, which we can then use to populate our select elements. And the API I'm going to use is found at exchangerate.host. And this is an amazing API because we don't need to actually sign up for any API keys. Not that there's any problem with that because it's all free, but it'll just make this tutorial really simple and use the endpoints that are available on the API without having any setup. So if you scroll down on the home page, down towards the documentation, there are a few different endpoints that are available to us, and the one we're going to use to actually get the currency options is this supported symbols endpoint. And you might be able to see from the example here that if we make a request to this API exchangerate.hosts/symbols, this is the kind of data that we get back. We get a symbols property on the response that has all of the country codes and the descriptions for the available currency conversions that this API can use. So we're going to be making a request to this endpoint in our getCurrencyOptions function. And we'll be doing that using the fetch API. So you might be familiar with this sort of syntax where we say, let's fetch the data from this URL. And then because this returns a promise, you would then start accessing the then property or the catch and the finally properties that are available on a promise. But we're not going to do that this time. We're actually going to make this appear synchronous by using the async and await keywords. So whereas we would normally use the then block, we can actually assign the result of the response directly inside of a response variable. And if you've used the fetch API before, you'll know that there's a JSON function that we can call on the response object, which will actually give us the JSON data back and store it in an object. So I'm just going to create another variable called JSON, and that will hold basically all of this data that we can see on the page as a JavaScript object. And then from that, we actually want to return the JSON.symbols property. So again, just accessing this symbols property that's available on the data, and that will give us an object that has the keys as the actual codes, but it's also got the descriptions in there as well. So if I was just going to run this code as it is, so if I call get currency options in our JavaScript, and if I go over to the actual app that we've got running, you can see in our console that we're getting a problem because response.json isn't available on this response object because this is actually returning a promise. So if I just log that out to the console just to demonstrate to you, you can see that what we've got inside of that response variable at the moment is just a pending or an unfulfilled promise. So we can't access the response.json function that's available on there until we use the async and await keywords and make this appear synchronous. So the way we do that is just before our fetch call, we say await the result of the call to that URL. And this is actually giving us an error in Visual Studio Code because we're only allowed to use this await keyword once we've declared that the function is asynchronous. And we do that just before the function definition. So we say this arrow function is actually async. So if we save that now, actually if we just log that out to the console again so you can see the response object for the second time. So you can see this time, instead of just giving us an unfulfilled promise, we've actually got the response object that fetch returns to us with all of the information about the request that's been made. And we'll also have the JSON function available on there, which means we can make the call to this function. The only problem is with that JSON function is it does actually return a promise as well. So we need to use the await keyword again in front of that JSON function, just so that we actually await the response of that to get the symbols that are in the actual response from the API. So what we should have now when we actually make a call to the get currency options function is the list of symbols that are available from the API. Now if we do actually log this to the console, you'll see we don't actually get the result that we're expecting, because you should expect to see just the list of values that have been provided from the API, but we actually get a promise instead when we logged this to the console. And that's because by declaring this function async, we're actually saying that we're going to be returning a promise from this function. So if we want to use the result that's inside of here, we need to call the await keyword again, or we can use the then property as well to log details to the console as well. So we could do something like this. And you can see finally now in the output in the console, we're actually getting that list of country codes and also their descriptions. So let's look at some more examples to actually concrete this, and then we'll see how we can use the async functions that we're creating to bring all the data together when we're ready to, when the form has been submitted. So we're going to create another function called getCurrencyRate. So in order to convert an amount from one currency to another, we actually need to have a function that will take the from currency and the to currency and actually make a conversion request. So let's say we're going to have an arrow function here with a from currency and a to currency. So with those two bits of information that have been passed to the function, we can actually make another call to the exchange rate host API. And this time we're going to look at the endpoint for actually converting a currency. So this is going to get us the base rate to convert. There is actually an amount parameter that you can pass to it as well, and it'll do this all for us, but we're just going to get the base rate of what it is to convert 1 unit of the from currency to the to currency, and then we'll actually do that conversion ourselves. But the endpoint itself looks a little bit like this. So basically we make a call to the API again, and then we just pass in the from and to symbols that were retrieved from the currency options call earlier on, and that does all of the hard work for us. So let's grab that URL, and we're going to do pretty much the same thing that we did in the previous function, but I'm first going to create a URL object. So a URL object, if you haven't used it in JavaScript before, is really useful because we can do things directly to the URL, like adding search parameters, and it's a nice and clean way of doing that rather than creating a template literal with the different parameters that we need. So we're going to say we want a new URL, and on that URL, on that currency convert URL, for the search parameters, we're going to append the from parameter, which you can see in the example they give us here is this first bit here. And then we're going to use the from currency argument that's been passed into the function. And then we want to do the same thing for to as well. So we're going to have the to search param that's been provided via the argument to the function. And then the rest of the actual function is going to be exactly the same as what we had in the previous get currency options function. So we're going to create a response object, which is going to be the result of a fetch call. And we can just pass in that currency convert URL object that we've created. And then we're going to get the JSON for that, the actual data that gives us in the response. So I'll say response JSON, and then we'll just return JSON dot result because there is actually a result property. If we have a look at that actually in the browser, just to show you what it looks like. So the result will actually give us the rate of converting 1 unit of US dollars to euros in this example, so we can use that in our calculations within the rest of our app. So notice, of course, we've got the problem again that we had with await not being allowed in this function, and that's simply solved by saying that this function is asynchronous. So before we actually get the event listener set up for our form, we actually need to populate the select elements to give information about what currencies are supported. So we're going to create a few different functions to do this. We're going to break it down into simple functions so we can see how each of these works together to actually create our UI for us. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a function called append option to select. So with a select element in HTML, we need to have various different options inside of there. And this function is going to have the job of taking one of those select elements. So we'll pass that in as an argument. And then we'll be able to actually generate a new option HTML element and insert that into the select element. So thereby we'll be populating the list of options that are available to us based on the data that's passed in. But this function is just to do one item at a time. So we're going to pass in one item option. So for the option element, we're just going to make a call to document.create element, and of course it's an option element that we want to create. So then we'll set some properties up on this. So the first one being the value of the actual option element. So this option item will basically have the result of the symbols call that we've got. So each of these you can think of being as one of the option items that we're passing in here. So we're going to have a code, which is the country code or the currency code that we can use for our lookup. And then the option element text content is equal to the option item dot description. And then all we need to do with the select element that's been passed in, so this is either the from or the to currency, we're going to pass or append, the child of the option element that we've just created. So this function does one distinct thing. It creates a new option element and adds it onto one of the select elements that's been passed in as an argument. And so we can call this multiple times with all of the data that's inside of this result from the symbols here. Another function which will do that for us, or at least it will take a select element and take in a list of those options. So we'll say an option list. So the option list that is passed in, for each of those, it will be an array. We'll get one of these option items, and then all we need to do is call that function several times. So we'll say append option to select, and we'll just pass in this select element and the option item that's in that loop. So again, this function has a very distinct purpose. It will take the select element that we want to populate and a list of all of these options, and then it will go through the list of options that have been passed in and call this function multiple times to create all of those options. So those are just a few helpful functions. We actually need to now create a function which will set up the currencies for us, or set up the select elements at least. So I'm going to make this function asynchronous because we need to make a call to this first function that we created for getting the currency options. So let's set that up down here. So I'm actually going to get a reference to both of the select elements here. So the currency lem is equal to document.getElement by ID. And it is the from currency that we first of all want to get. And then the second one is going to be obviously the to currency. So I'll just change that here. And so with those two select elements referenced, we need the options that we want to populate them with. So then we make a call to the other function that we created earlier on. So the currency options is going to be equal to await get currency options. And because we've used the await keyword, we don't need to use any of the then blocks. This currency options variable will actually have a list of all of these symbols as we set up in the previous function. So we actually want to have these in an array format. We don't want to have objects as the keys. We just basically need a list of these description and codes for our option items to populate the select elements. So just to do that, I'm just going to convert, to get the currencies, I'm just going to say object.keys for the currency options that we've just retrieved. And I'm actually just going to map those. And for each of the currency keys that we get, which will be AED, AFN, it'll be these keys that we've got down here. I'm just going to actually grab the item from the object. So we'll say from those currency options that we've got, I want to grab the value that's inside of the currency key. So just to explain what, I'll log this out to the console so you can see what that looks like, and we can check that we've done this right as well. So if we call this setup currencies function down here, and then just go back to our app. Oh, I've just made a little bit of a typo here. Should be currency key and not currency keys. You can see when that code runs, we're actually making the network request to the API, and we're getting all of those currencies coming out as an array. There's 171 of them, which is quite a lot. But you can see here that it's just an array with the description and the codes as has been returned from the API data. So all we really need to do at this point then is to take those currencies and populate the two elements that we've got. And then we can use the function that we created above just to do that. So we've got the from currency element, pass in currencies. And then of course the other one is the to currency element. So if we just save that. And what you should find now is when we actually set up the currencies, we're getting that data and populating the select elements. And you can see here that they've got all of the descriptions that are inside of those options that have been returned from the API. So our app is almost ready to go. The only thing we haven't done is actually set up the event listener to do the conversion, and we need to call the second function that we created earlier on as well, the get currency rate, to do that conversion. So we're going to set up an event listener, and I'm going to set it up in a separate function. You don't need to do this, but obviously it just keeps things a bit separate. We can call the functions individually when we're ready. And for this, we're going to need to grab a reference to the form element, which we'll do by saying document.get element by ID, and it had the ID of convert form. And then basically on that form element, we are going to add an event listener of submit. So this can be either triggered when the users hit return or whether the user hits the button, obviously. And we're going to have the event object in there because we want to call event.preventDefault so that when we click the actual button, it doesn't try and reload the page and stop our JavaScript from working. So when the user clicks that button, we need to get 3 different bits of information. We need to get the from currency, the to currency that they want to convert to, but also the amount as well. Let's grab a reference to all of those elements now. So we'll say the from currency is equal to document.get element by ID from currency, and the same for the to currency as well. So those are 2 really useful bits of information, and also the amount as well. So we'll say the amount is equal to document.get element by ID again. And of course, this time it's amount was the ID that we gave to that. And also, in addition to that, we want to get a reference to the convert result element. And we'll say document.get element by ID and the convert result. And don't forget, we need that to actually put some information back to the user as well. So we've got a reference to all of those elements in this function, and so we're ready to make use of them here. So we need to get the rate of the conversion between the 2 currencies that we've got. So we can do that by making a call to that function that we created earlier on. So get currency rate. And we'll get from the from currency element that we've got, we want to get the value that's inside of there. And also to the to currency, that was the other argument that we needed for this function. We'll get the from the element, from the select element, the to currency value that's set on the option that's selected. So don't forget that this get currency function is actually asynchronous. We use the async keyword, so we can use the await keyword to make sure that this value that's returned from it is stored in this variable rather than creating a promise chain here. But of course, we're getting the same problem saying that we need to say that this function that we're using is asynchronous. So where do we put that? Do we put it at the top here in this setup event listener? Well, you can actually put it in line here where we're using this anonymous function inside of the event listener. So if we just say this is an async function, then the error goes away, and of course we can use that await keyword to store the result from this function directly in this rate variable. So with that set up, we're in a good position now where we can just do our calculations and display the result to the user. So we'll say the amount value. I'm just going to wrap this in a number because we're working with strings. So we're going to get the amount element that we set up before and get the value that's inside of that. So we now know the value that's inside of that input box. And then we'll get the conversion result. So we'll say the conversion result is equal to, again, a number. And we've got the amount value that we've just calculated times the rate that's come back from the API. And we want to make sure that we're only getting it to 2 fixed decimal places. So we'll call the toFixed method on the result that we get from that. And then with that in place, we can then access the convert result element and update its text content property. And we're just going to create a big long template literal here. So the amount value is what the user's typed in, and then the from currency dot value. So this is the actual code that's being used to do the lookup is equal to conversion result. So this is the to currency value, and then we'll get access to the value code that's inside of the to currency select box. So just a quick summary in this function, because we've done a few things. We've got all of the elements from the form that we need. We've calculated the rate by making another request to the exchange rate API, passing in the codes for the selected items that are in these two select boxes here. And then we've calculated the conversion by using that rate multiplied by the amount value that's stored inside of here. So if we just run this function to set up the event listener, so that's all ready to go, we'll call it after we've set up the currencies. I'll call that function there. So the form should now be ready for us to actually use. And you see there, just clicking the button, we're actually getting the 2 currency values here, which are exactly the same in this instance, and we're doing a comparison for 0. So let's do something a bit more interesting. We'll say 50, let's say US dollars, and how much is that in British pounds sterling. So if we click convert there, you can see that 50 US dollars at the moment is equivalent to 44.73 Great British pounds. So our event listener is set up and working, and of course we're using the await keyword to make the calls to get the currency rate, do the conversion and display it to the user, all without using a promise chain because we're using the async and await keywords. So before we finish up, we should probably think about how we're going to handle errors in our app, and there are various different places where things could go wrong, but just as an example, we're going to look for errors for when we're calling this code here, where we're calling the getCurrencyRate function, because that's making a call out to the API, which if it fails, we can't actually do the currency conversion. So normally when you're working with a promise chain, you would have to actually use the catch part of the promise chain. You use the catch property, which would then give you the error, and you could do something with the error there, and you can still do that when you're working with async functions as well. But what's more common to do is to actually wrap the code that's appearing to be synchronous, which in our case is this call to the getCurrencyRate function, in a try catch block, which is what you would normally do in JavaScript when you're not working with a promise chain. So let's do that now to trap any errors that come out of this particular section. So we're going to wrap this bit here where we're doing the conversion and the convert result all inside of the try block. You can just limit it to the actual function call itself, but we only want to really run this code if the call to get the rate is successful. And then if not, we're going to catch the error that comes from that. And we can do something different if there is a problem. So if we just save that, we should find that that works exactly the same now. Let's just put in some values into the convert box here. Click the convert button. So when there isn't a problem, the currency converter will run all of this code inside of the try block and obviously update the text content. But if there is a problem, then we need to catch that error here and do something about it. And we're just going to basically use the element that we've got down here to display the result and actually put in a message to tell them that something's gone wrong. And we'll also add the class to change that convert result element into an error class. So here we'll use a template literal and we'll just say there was an error getting the conversion rate, and we could put the details of the error in there. So we'll say error message, for example. And of course, to change the styling of the convert result element, don't forget in the CSS earlier on, we created an error class for this convert result element. So if there is a problem, we're going to basically turn the background color to be red, just to highlight that that's a real problem. So if we just review what we've got here, basically we're using the try-catch approach to try and get the currency rate for this particular conversion. And then if that is successful, we'll continue to run the code and update the UI on the page. But if there is an error, we're just going to put this message into the convert result element and change the color to red. So we can simulate an error in our code here just by setting ourselves to be offline inside of our network tab. So that would obviously block the connection to the API and would cause the error to occur. So if we just click the convert button here now, you can see we've got that red text and saying there was an error getting the conversion rate. And the error that we're getting back is saying that it's failed to fetch, which is obvious because we've actually blocked the connection by setting ourselves to be offline. So that's how you would handle errors with async and await. You'd use a try-catch block, and as you can see, it does make it quite readable because you can see what is actually going to run if the code inside of the try section is successful, and you can see what will happen if there's an error because the code inside of this catch block will be run instead. So using promises and async and await isn't just restricted to making network requests from APIs, and if you want to get a good feel of how to use promises within other parts of your UI, then you should check out this next tutorial where we're going to be making a custom modal pop-up that's all based on promises and asynchronous code. But that's it for this tutorial. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.